Awful music aside, Xue Yu Xin takes place at the end of the Second World War and goes into the Chinese Civil War, which intrigues me. After all, there are a few anime that delve into real history. Thing is, however, whenever you're depicting real history, you have to take care to properly portray the events, rather than skew them for a specific narrative. Xue Yu Xin skews them very much towards the Chinese Communist Party, by completely avoiding several uncomfortable aspects. The plot is centered around Tsunohara, a Japanese kid who lives in Manchuria after Imperial Japan conquered and resettled the region. He grows up wanting to be a soldier, but sees the Japanese troops oppressing Chinese civilians. Then as the war draws to a close, the soldiers depart, leaving all their civilians behind. Tsunohara, his mother and sisters flee to a village and pretend to be Chinese, despite him only knowing the language. Thankfully, the entire village is okay with them, despite knowing they're Japanese. He works under a cruel rich man, then the Chinese nationalists arrive and force the village's men into service. The communists arrive, driving away the nationalists and distribute the land to the people.
And we give it back to you, the people.
After a large celebration, Tsunohara joins the Communist army, trains for a bit, spies against the nationalists, fights them in battle, joins the Korean War, and has to endure god-awful singing. His mother dies and reveals their Japanese origin, and he is taken away from the battlefield to work out whatever this place is supposed to be. Finally, he is forced to go back to Japan, where he continued to work on improving relations between the two countries. And it's thanks to people like him, Communist China and Japan have been close friends ever since.
That's a fake laugh.
It's real!
So this anime takes certain liberties, but first I'll express the accurate stuff. The Japanese certainly did settle hundreds of thousands of their own citizens into Manchuria, then abandoned most of them in 1945. Interestingly, the anime takes a nuanced view of the Japanese, both showing their brutality and showing some being honourable. Honestly, they could have gone much further with the atrocities they committed, but since it's from a kid's point of view, I'll let it slide. The nationalists did indeed force men into their army, and though it's hinted at, the conditions they suffered were utterly horrifying. Honestly, looking at the history, you really see the sheer amount of war crimes the nationalists inflicted upon the people. And from that, you realise why the communists were incredibly popular at the time. Another reason for their popularity was the distribution of land from the rich to the poor, which was welcomed by almost everyone, but more on that in a bit. The MiG-15 shown here really did outperform nearly all American aircraft, though it is important to note these came from the Soviet Union, not whatever this Chinese-Japanese school was. And finally, Megami Tsunohara was a real person who did try and bridge relations between the two countries, despite the tension between the two. Which leads me on to the liberties Xue Yu Xin takes. In the little propaganda pieces after each episode, the anime states 300,000 Japanese settlers were moved into Manchuria, except in reality there was 1.5 million of them by 1945. Then when the Japanese army made for the coast, the situation wasn't exactly some committed suicide and some died of hunger and disease. When the Soviets invaded the region, they looted, raped and murdered the Japanese civilians, with just some lovely highlights such as these. All of which were after the emperor announced they would surrender unconditionally. It is important to note there were many mass Japanese suicides, and that Chinese and particularly Korean civilians also suffered under the invasion. Anyway, the Soviets also sent the 600,000 Japanese soldiers who surrendered to Siberian labour camps, where 10% of them died. They then proceeded to occupy the whole of Manchuria for 9 months, where around 250 to 350,000 Japanese civilians died, while they played the communists and nationalists off each other. At the end of it, they signed, I'm not making this up, the Treaty of Friendship and Alliance with the nationalists, where they would give them Inner Manchuria in exchange for recognition of their dominance over Mongolia. Later that year, though, they betrayed them, massively supplying the communists so they can take Inner Manchuria from the nationalists, all in order to create a buffer state.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
So, considering Tsunohara's village is smack down in the middle of all this, it's kind of awkward the Soviet invasion and subsequent occupation is never brought up in the entire show. Moving on to the Civil War itself, obviously the anime depicts the communists as this really great force, welcomed by everyone they passed, who created rainbows and budding flowers everywhere they went. So, that's not what really happened.
If you weren't poor, if you were better off, then you were guilty. That's how they reasoned.
Land reform had become mob rule. It tore families and villages apart. The communists began to lose support. In December 1947, Mao urged restraint. 5 months later, the movement was stopped. The communists tried to minimize the damage and backtracked to their moderate wartime policies. They managed to salvage peasant support.
Little wonder they had the landlord and his son flee the village before the communists arrive, as having him and his family brought out to be beaten and killed by the mob wouldn't exactly send the right message. Also, it highlights an interesting parallel that the anime fails to notice. Interestingly, when I looked up the real sources of Sunohara, I found a couple where it describes the landlord as a kind man who admired, praised, and rewarded him, not exactly paying him in sawdust and rotten apples with frequent beatings. Moving on to the Korean War, while both the North and South actively planned to start it, it was the North who invaded the South. And using an immense amount of Soviet weapons, and with poor South Korean leadership, they pushed the Allies to the edge of the peninsula. With UN reinforcements and a daring amphibious assault, the UN forces pushed the North back and invaded North Korea. This was where the Americans, quote, brazenly crossed the 38th parallel. Also, the American bombing of Andong
Get your mind out of the gutter!
was in reality the Americans bombing only the bridge on the North Korean side, intentionally not hitting Chinese territory. The main reason for Chinese involvement was simply not wanting an American ally on their border. Furthermore, this all doesn't mention the sheer amount of casualties the Chinese suffered in the war, and it ended in a never-ending stalemate. As for the Japanese airbase, I simply could not find any sources for this, and considering it's supposed to be staffed by former Japanese POWs, it just simply does not ring true for me. The anime then ends with Sunohara going back to Japan in 1955, and while this is accurate for the real-life man, it conveniently avoids what happens a few years after the communists take power, such as executing thousands of well-off people.
Thousands were jailed or executed. People with money, with foreign connections, or with ties to the previous regime. Across China, hundreds of thousands of landlords were killed.
Or the peasant farmers forced into collectives.
All of China's 600 million peasants were working in huge collectives. For the first time in history, the farm output of the entire nation was under government control. The government decided how much grain the peasants could keep. The rest had to be sold at low prices to the state.
The grain ration for the peasants was very low, not enough. Plus, you had to obey the leadership. You had to fulfill the state quota. State first, then the people.
Collectives did not make the peasants better off, nor did they increase production.
Or when Mao decided to rid China of intellectuals.
Nearly 1 million people were condemned as rightists. They were sent to jail and prison camps or to work in the countryside. The anti-rightist campaign effectively silenced China's intellectuals.
Or the largest famine in all of history.
In 1958, Mao launched his most ambitious campaign to date, the Great Leap Forward. Under pressure to produce more, to launch satellites to heaven, as it was called, party officials inflated production figures. An ominous cycle began as the state took more and more grain based on false figures, leaving the peasants with nothing to eat.
For example, the output was 5 tons of grain, but 10 tons were reported. Then the state would collect grain based on 10 tons.
The famine lasted 3 years. An estimated 30 million people died.
So yeah, his sisters and friends no doubt laboured every day for little to no pay while starving to death, and had Sunohara stayed, he might have been killed or jailed for being an intelligent foreigner. Hence, the anime is firmly a propaganda piece designed to portray communist China in the most positive light imaginable, without going into any nuance whatsoever. I mean, they literally end each episode with a black and white minute-long documentary explaining how great the communists were. Though, when you remove the awkward truth and judge the story by its own merits, it's poorly done. The stakes are non-existent since we aren't told which side is winning until it's over, and every piece of dialogue is way too on the nose.
今日から新居での生活が始まる。
満州人には気を使うのに、親友の話を無視するのか。
準備。
選挙が怪しくなって、関東軍の内部が払っている。これだといつまで持つか。
無敵の軍人になってはな。 みんな普通の人間だ。私たちのように卓上のために。
国籍都是人家给的，还不是咋说咋是？更别提他还有个军官儿子。
The world building is poor with little connection to the settings. One moment he's training, then spying in a nationalist controlled town, then fighting on the front lines, and 2 years spent battling in Korea. All of these events are done within just 3 episodes, swiftly glossing over each situation without any explanation of the conditions he or his soldiers suffered. If they really wanted to portray his devotion to communism, then they should have explored his aspirations, explored his rationalization, and perhaps most of all, explored opposing views. All of this would have greatly highlighted his devotion to the cause, rather than just saying, of course he personally joins the communists, they're the best thing ever. More annoying than that, however, were all the characters who disappeared entirely from the plot. The kind family servant who leaves to join the communist army, the evil rich man and his nationalist son, the 2 sisters, and the mother who suddenly died. Not one of them gets a satisfying conclusion and makes the entire plot feel hollow. So other than one scene where Zhang teaches Sunohara tricks about spying, there's nothing in Xue Yu Xin worth your time. However, I will still say it is by far the best propaganda piece out of the 3 here, specifically because it has some accuracy towards history. Which brings me on to...
What's he think I look like? A jackass?
You sure do!
Oh yes, if you thought I might shy away from politics, you thought wrong. So, 2000 Mules is a 1.5 hour non-documentary, chock-a-block filled with...
alternative facts.
Which all falls apart at the slightest scrutiny. I mean, the film centres around the absurd idea the Democrats are competent for Pete's sake. So the film begins with glitchy Biden saying something foolish and goes into how important elections are, but conveniently doesn't mention the importance of trust in the system.
I can't remember what I've forgotten.
After a misleading montage of conspiracy theories, see counters to these below, the host talks about his background a little.
I started my podcast in early 2021 to speak the truth. But by simply asking questions about election fraud, you get booted from YouTube and Facebook.
Your teachers don't want to tell you, but they are scared, and they should be, because the very fabric of this elementary school is tearing from all corners.
Oh, geez.
But hey, I'm just a normal kid, like you, except that I ask questions. And because I'm brave enough to ask questions, I come under scrutinies.
After that, we're introduced to the armchair guys, and these scenes are hilariously stupid. They involve our host asking leading questions to 5 guys of the same conspiracy viewpoint, so we end up with each of them spouting increasingly ridiculous ideas without any kind of evidence or challenge.
Trump, to his credit, tweeted out in July, mail-in ballots are a disaster, and he was attacked so hard by Kemp and Ducey and so many.
But he didn't have this information, obviously.
His instinct.
Yes, I heard it was a Chinese fellow, and he acted alone.
Hand me those ballots, and the person did. What do you think you would see? Whose name is on it, in your opinion?
Ineligible voters, people that have moved.
No, actually, they say he was Norwegian.
You are talking about 200,000-300,000 ballots that were just harvested in only your geolocated locations. But you are talking, what, 5% of America?
Less.
Less than 5%, okay. So the case closed. Sorry, gentlemen, lady, case closed.
All right, so
In fact, it was a gang of elderly Norwegians.
They have ruined Election Day in the United States of America. That's provable. And that's enough for me to fight the left with every fiber in my body.
Yes, I heard it from a very reliable source that it was a gang of red-headed elderly Norwegians with very tiny feet.
So, skipping those scenes, we get to the main subject of the film. A theory that thousands of people were paid to stuff hundreds of ballots in drop boxes across 5 key states. The only evidence the film has for this is the tracking of hundreds of thousands of mobile phones, and flagging anyone who passed by 10 or more ballots before the election.
A mule is, by our definition, a person that is involved in picking up ballots from locations and running them to the drop boxes.
Do we know, by the way, how much they get paid?
According to the people that have shared information with us, it's generally $10 a ballot.
So what was the criterion that you set?
Final decision was they had to have been to 10 or more drop boxes, meaning unique visits inside of a space. Across the country, we bought 10 trillion signals.
Goodness knows what 10 trillion signals means, especially if they only focus on 5 states, but more to the point, this theory breaks apart on so many levels. Firstly, each of these states have millions of people commuting and going about their lives, so flagging anyone who passes within the vicinity of said boxes won't be accurate in any way. Second, these boxes were placed in high traffic and populated areas, some even beside roads so people can vote by car. Third, the film doesn't account for any jobs related to driving around cities, such as taxi drivers, postal workers, policemen, delivery drivers, handymen, florists, door-to-door salesmen, or even the people who set up and collect the boxes. And fourth, and probably most damning, is that it is done over a 2-week period.
During a 2-week period.
For a theory that relies on just being within the general vicinity of ballot boxes, 2 weeks is an incredibly long time. Oh wait, hang on.
What's the time period?
October 1st through the election.
A month.
Knowing all that, I'm surprised they didn't find tens of thousands in each city. Although that would rely on them actually being able to accurately map millions of phone locations. Sorry, 10 trillion signals over a month. How could I forget? Such a feat would require unquestionably large resources, which is far more than just
a team of highly skilled contractors and put together a plan to see where the data would take us.
Also, tracking millions of non-criminals for the purpose of pushing a specific political narrative is kind of questionable.
I predict right now they will say, what on earth is a conservative doing tracking private citizens? Gee, how dare, what is the National D'Souza doing to voters?
This is wrong.
And as it turns out, probably illegal in certain states, including Michigan, which states the tracking of any device inside a car without the owner's permission is a misdemeanor. But surely the brilliant minds behind 2000 Mules wouldn't outright state they track people in their cars, right?
Movement of the individual cell phone signals. You had to get off the highway, you had to go on surface streets, you had to turn in somewhere in order to get to those drop boxes.
And then Wisconsin, which clearly prohibits the use of global positioning devices to obtain a person's location without their consent.
This is a smoking gun. This is O.J. Simpson being seen leaving the scene of the crime. I don't care how partisan you are, you can't dismiss all of this.
So either they're lying and made up the whole system, or they're breaking the law and lying. Which leads me on to the maps they show, as they're blatant lies. The first one supposedly shows someone driving around to 28 boxes in one day.
In Atlanta, Georgia, they went to 28 drop boxes in 5 organizations in one day.
What are the orange dots?
Those are drop boxes.
Except the orange dots don't correspond with the actual Dropbox locations. Furthermore, they don't present any video evidence or suspects who made the journey, despite having
4 million minutes of surveillance video around the country.
And yet they didn't bother showing any suspects whatsoever about this journey. Oh, and the second map, which they say is
Gwinnett County,
is actually a flipped picture of Moscow. As for the camera footage they use, there's no evidence of them stuffing ballots, and several clearly show someone posting a single ballot for goodness sake. Probably because stuffing ballots is a stupid idea. Each one has to be sent to a voter, or a voter has to request one. The form has to be filled out with all the correct details, then once the voter receives the ballot and posts it, come the election it has to be checked and then checked again, with any small amount of discrepancy rejecting the ballot.
Every single mail ballot in every state in the country has to be verified. Elections officials here are taking a look at the signatures to make sure that you are who you say you are when you send in that ballot. They're comparing the signature on the ballot to a signature on file from, say, a driver's license or your election registration form.
Before they can be counted, absentee ballots have to go through an extra step, verification. Election officials, always working in those bipartisan teams, scan the sealed envelopes into a computer system. Next, they check the signature on the ballot envelope against the signature in the state's voter registration database. If an envelope is missing one of those requirements, the whole ballot is invalid.
Why would hundreds of duplicates and falsified ballots be counted against this bipartisan system? Incidentally, a lot of mail-in ballots were discounted in the 2020 election because their signatures didn't quite match up to the system. So the system is biased against mail-in ballots. 2000 Mules does attempt to explain this away.
When you mail in a ballot, you have a security envelope with the signature verification standard that's been all but washed away.
How would that even go? Hey, we got over 1,000 identical envelopes with missing signatures, but all with the same address. What should I do with them, boss? Just process them. Brad over there has over 3,000 envelopes with identical signatures. If it's in the box, then it's counted. It gets worse when you consider all ballot boxes within certain districts will go to the same counting place anyway. So what's the point of driving around to different boxes when you could just dump them all in one and have the same result? One last thing to note was the filmmakers had access to, what was it again?
4 million minutes of surveillance video around the country.
Ah yes, over 7 years of CCTV footage, and not a single person is shown travelling from one box to another. Considering this is their entire theory, you think that with all their data they would at least show one example, but they don't, because the only asses in this film are the ones speaking.
To widen the search, Greg and his team lowered the criterion from 10 or more to 5 or more drop boxes. This revealed a huge upsurge in the number of mules from 2,000 to 54,000. 54,000 mules.
Oh my goodness, 54,000 mules caused over 800,000 illegal votes? What if we lowered the criteria even further to those who passed 2 voting booths? According to my own data, you get over 20 million mules. And with a conservative estimate of 3 ballots dumped per person, you get 120 million illegal votes. How do you count for that?
And because I'm brave enough to ask questions, I come under scrutinies.
But then, what if we take it one step further and count everyone who definitely used one booth? Over 200 million mules. And with a conservative estimate of 2,356 ballots per mule, you get...
My God, that's... I don't even know what that is.
Nobody does.
Overall, 2,000 mules is a bafflingly stupid attempt to discredit the 2020 election, and it is just filled with all kinds of blatant inaccuracies, lies, and wild speculation, none of which hold up to the slightest scrutiny. Funnily enough, there were examples of attempted fraud in the election, which they don't bring up at all for some reason.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state, and flipping the state is a great testament to our country. Okay? You're not allowed to do that, and that's what you've done. This is a faulty election result. And honestly, this should go very fast. You should meet tomorrow, because you have a big election coming up, and because of what you've done to the president, you know, the people of Georgia know that this was a scam. And because of what you've done to the president, a lot of people aren't going out to vote. And a lot of Republicans are going to vote negative because they hate what you did to the president. Okay? They hate it. And they're going to vote. And if you would be respected, really respected, if this thing could be straightened out before the election. You have a big election coming up on Tuesday. There is no way you lost Georgia. Nobody, everyone knows I won it by hundreds of thousands of votes. But I'll tell you, it's going to have a big impact on Tuesday if you guys don't get this thing straightened out fast.
Not all attempts at cheating succeed.
But the truth isn't the point here. The point of this film isn't to uncover some grand conspiracy, but to push the false narrative the Republicans won the 2020 election.
The seeds have been planted.
Far-right news outlets, social media and commentators have upheld this conspiracy film as evidence of this, without going into any details at all, because of course they don't.
Their ability to keep their side ignorant is total.
This is an incredibly dangerous narrative, as democracies survive on the acceptance of the loser. However, as this rhetoric is repeated over and over again across enough platforms, the greater the number of people will believe it was stolen.
A lie told once remains a lie, but a lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth.
If you say it long enough, hard enough, often enough, people will start to believe it.
Now, with more than a third of Republicans believing the election was stolen, another third unsure of the results, and endorsed by poll workers and Republican officials, I look at the next election with a great sense of foreboding. And that's exactly why I detest films like this, which do nothing but carelessly add fuel to the fire. Which is a nice transition to... she's a lady. Alright, first off, Queen. That is what a female monarch is. Woman king sounds like you forgot what the word is, like when I forgot what a conveyor belt was called and blurted out flat escalator. In any case, I seriously cannot decide which is worse for society. Giving ammunition to right-wing nutters who never try and see the other side of politics, or this insidious propaganda. When this came out, it sparked quite the controversy, as just like Xue Yu Xin, it skews history towards a specific narrative, and in much the same way. Set in 1823, the film depicts the female warriors of Dahomey valiantly fighting to free their nation from the slave trading kingdom of Oyo. By the end they succeed, and their king declares that no longer will they trade in slaves, which they state are only the evil fighters and slavers they captured, as a sort of karma, I guess.
Those are the heads. Some of the men who raided our village. The rest will be sold in Wida.
We've come to trade. We sell them what they want.
But why do we sell our captives?
As you might have gleaned from all that, the film really leaves out some crucial information. The main thing being, the Kingdom of Dahomey constantly raided its neighbours to capture innocent people to sell into chattel slavery. In fact, the entire economy of Dahomey focused around the slave trade, and it became one of, if not the most prominent African kingdom to do it. So much so, King Gezo, the same one from the film, said in the 1840s, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth." Why? Well, guns and power, of course. The more they traded captured innocents, the more guns they could buy from the Europeans, and the more strength they could harness to throw off their tributary master the Oyo, which they did in 1823.
Yep, here we go.
The war itself is horribly skewed towards Dahomey, both morally and in power. At this point, the Oyo was weakened by an ongoing political crisis and a reduced military. Dahomey took advantage of this to raid their land. Oyo demanded a large tribute in response, and King Gezo sent his Brazilian viceroy, Francisco de Souza, to negotiate. Incidentally, this white man helped Gezo overthrow his brother to become king 5 years earlier, and who continued to sell droves of slaves. Anyway, talks broke down, Oyo invaded and was decisively defeated. Dahomey subsequently began raiding former Oyo land, selling even more slaves. Interestingly, in 1825, King Gezo sold great numbers of his own people into slavery, destroying a number of Dahomey's towns and villages to do so, as a result of some military defeats he suffered. So the film fails to mention how the entire kingdom focused around slavery, but they did abolish the trade and produce palm oil instead, right? Afraid it wasn't until 1852 when they got rid of the appalling act, a full 30 years after the film takes place, and it wasn't because King Gezo's heart grew 3 sizes that day. It was, drumroll please, the British. For several decades by this point, the British had abolished slavery and demanded Dahomey do the same. When Gezo refused, giving the stated quote from earlier, the British blockaded their coast for a year, after which Dahomey gave in, abolishing its slave trade. Okay, so the kingdom was built upon death and slavery, but surely the women warriors are accurate. After all, they're the centre focus of the show, right? Well, it depicts them as a disciplined but righteous force who find slavery abhorrent. Is that accurate?
Not one bit.
Yeah, the Ryogoji were exceedingly cruel. Whenever they would raid a village, they beheaded the elderly, ripped the bottom jaws off many of the survivors, burned down the buildings, and take the young to be sold into chattel slavery. It was even common for them to return home with rotting heads and genitals of those they killed. Oh, and it gets worse. The capital engaged in annual human sacrifice where around 500 captured innocents would be beheaded. And as for their training, they certainly didn't use wicker men, that's for sure. Hence the controversy. The Woman King glorifies the abhorrent slave trading kingdom of Dahomey and portrays its cruel warriors as a righteous, kind-hearted group who saved people from slavery. And this wasn't some simple error. They didn't create a collage of African kingdoms and throw a dart. No, they studied the history. They set it at a specific date, based the characters off real people, made the costumes, set up the backgrounds, and advertised it to audiences with a poster and trailer saying based on true events. Funnily, such a line doesn't appear in the film.
It was as if I had reached my lifelong limit of lives.
Moreover, there were other examples of African leaders fighting against slavery they could have depicted instead. An inspiring example being Queen Nzinga, who ruled the African kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba, who led fighters in a war against Portuguese to save her people from slavery. So why was this film made? Because Black Panther. That film was okay. On the one hand, the world building was abysmal and to my mind very racist. Oh, the highly advanced African nations still prefer straw huts, war rhinos and spears while deciding their rulers via trials by combat, do they?
We've got to celebrate our differences.
We got to celebrate our differences. Ooga booga doo, ooga booga doo.
On the other hand, it had an enjoyable goodies baddies plot. The characters were solid, mostly, and it was well acted, and the main character learned a valuable lesson.
I chose my people. I chose Wakanda. Our future depended on...
You are wrong! All of you are wrong! To turn your backs on the rest of the world!
But none of that mattered to the studios behind The Woman King. What they saw was an enormously successful film tapping into an unexplored market, namely a majority black cast with female warriors front and centre. But like a vampire to a cross, studios seemed to revile original ideas, so they had to find some sort of source to base their film upon. Evidently lacking any other option, they turned to history and massively perverted the truth to serve this narrative. Now, I'm sure there will be people out there who will say, who cares? This is a female and black empowerment film, and besides, it's fine for historical films to take liberties when portraying history. Afraid neither argument holds up. The empowerment argument fails because the studios could have made any number of original films with black women warriors, be they based on real people or not. Not to mention, you can't call it empowering when the film shies so far away from the actual history it's supposed to depict. Braveheart can't exactly be inspiring for the Scottish when the narrative is so wildly different from the actual history. As for the certain liberties argument, this is an especially pitiful argument. Zulu takes certain liberties, Chernobyl takes certain liberties, the Woman King goes out of his way to lie about history. Portraying the Dahomey Kingdom in this time period as a righteous people fighting against slavery is akin to portraying the British, Dutch, Spanish or Portuguese as nations who never dealt in slavery. The reality is, these nations greatly participated in the Atlantic slave trade, one of the most heinous things ever done by humanity. There isn't any argument against their involvement, and people should not try and defend it. Those who argue slavery has always been around chooses not to focus on the unimaginable horror and sheer scale of chattel slavery, the voyages very much included. Those who argue, oh, they got rid of it eventually, simply ignore the crimes these nations committed. And finally, those who argue one of these kingdoms were morally superior than the others, attempts to dampen or downright ignore the real harms their nations committed during this time.
The white man has brought immorality here.
So yeah, I don't know which one is worse for society. A film which perverts the truth in service of a society dividing narrative that aims to distort people's view of what really happened, or 2000 Mules. It gets worse when you discover this film was really popular in Benin, the modern day country which looks back on Dahomey as a positive, rather than truly wrestling with the issue. It's tough and it's uncomfortable, but learning about such massive events in our shared past is important, both for understanding the present and what humanity is capable of. Incidentally, Britain is terrible for this, and not just in the films produced. Nothing about the Empire is taught in schools, just a bit about the Tudors, maybe ancient history, then smash cut to the World Wars. Judging it as a film, however, it is just packed with generic tropes we've all seen before. The plucky underdog who helps her teammates over winning, the tough no-nonsense leader seeing herself in the underdog, the big celebration being interrupted by the villains, the boss telling the no-nonsense leader not to fight at the end of the second act, so she has to take matters into her own hands, the whole team following her despite orders not to, the girl meeting the hot guy who then gives her a token of his affection, and them secretly flirting with each other. Beyond that, the fighting scenes are a confusing mess with no clue which side is winning until they're over, and the plot being so uninspired, any investment sails merrily away. The only positive thing I can say about it was the acting, which was good across the board honestly, with one notable highlight for me being after the graduation race.
To be useful, she must stand on her own.
You would not help your friend, Migano.
Amenza? I would step on her head to win a foot race.
Nice little scene, honestly, but overall, it's a poorly written story that actively glorifies one of the most evil African kingdoms there ever was. And on that note, I shall begin my hardest review yet.